Nothing sounds quite like the Sea of Galilee. The Sea of Galilee is a picture. It's a picture of Maim Chaim, living water. Yes, Galilee is rain-fed, but it gets the volume of water that makes it a sea from the Jordan River. And the Jordan River flows into the Sea of Galilee and out of the Sea of Galilee. The Sea of Galilee is Maim Chaim, living water. But it's also another picture. The Sea of Galilee is a wild place. It's also a picture of chaos because it's unpredictable. And the Sea of Galilee can be whipped up into a frothing, furious body of water. It could be chaos. It's that chaotic picture I want to pick up on. It's that wild place. You know the story. Jesus had been teaching all day over here. He's absolutely exhausted. They take him with them in a boat, Mark tells us in chapter 4. And there were other boats with them. And Jesus falls asleep. Now there's a great storm that comes up on the lake. Bless God that some of his disciples are fishermen because they know how to handle and maneuver boats. But the way Mark tells it, do you know where Jesus falls asleep? He falls asleep at the stern, not at the bow, at the stern. Well, you know what's at the stern? The rudder. So here, Jesus is asleep at the stern of the boat in a storm. And I can see the disciples wrestling with that rudder, stepping over Jesus. He's in the way. He's in the way. Why do I need to know that? Why of all places would he fall asleep at the stern? Well, the storm gets stronger and stronger, angrier and angrier, and finally, and I think after a while, the disciples aren't even trying to avoid Jesus. They're kind of kicking him and stepping over him. Finally, he doesn't wake up. He doesn't wake up. Finally, someone says, "Teacher, teacher." They wake him up. "Don't you care if we drowned?" Now that's an interesting question. He who did not consider glory something to be grasped, but emptied himself, took upon himself the form of a servant. Here, this one who had been teaching all day the words of life, and those closest to him shake him from his slumber, asking him this question, "Don't you care?" Nope. No, I don't really care about you guys. Of course he cares. He loves them. I would also argue that he might just be a tad offended with that question. So Jesus gets up and says, "Peace, be still." And it is peaceful, and it is still. And then Jesus turns to his disciples. And the way it's translated, it reads this way: "Why are you so afraid?" Now in Greek, the word for fear is phobos. It's where we get the word phobia. That's not the word that Jesus uses here. In fact, the word that Jesus uses here in this story is dailos. Now that word is only used in Matthew's telling of the same story, because he asked the disciples the same thing. Why are you so afraid? Why are you so dailos? And the other place that word is used, the only other place, you ready for it? And this is the word that Jesus uses to address his disciples. But the cowardly. Dailos means cowardly. But the cowardly, the unbelieving, the vile, the murderers, the sexually immoral, those who practice magic arts, the idolaters, and all liars, their place will be in the fiery lake of burning sulfur. This is the second death. Tell me that Jesus isn't a little upset with the question, don't you care? This is not only a wild place for the disciples, but I would argue it's potentially a wild place for Jesus. I've taught, I've parented, I've led, and I've been disappointed. And that's not a good feeling. And the word he uses to address his disciples is a word of people who are consigned to the second death, the fiery lake, to hell itself. This is an emotionally charged incident for Jesus. Don't you care? You cowards. Well, here's something else about this story. This story of the calming of the sea, peace be still, it happens in the Gospel of Mark, and Matthew tells the same story. But in Matthew's story, when the disciples wake up Jesus, they say, Lord, don't you care if we drown? Lord, don't you care if we drown? In Mark, they say, Teacher, didaskale, teacher, don't you care if we drown? Why the difference? And if what I'm suggesting might have some merit to it, it will help me to understand why Jesus is so upset. Not just by their question, but because of, well, let me tell you. When you open up the Gospel of Mark, the 4th chapter, and if you have a Bible like I have a red-lettered Bible. The red letters are the translators' attempt to help you to understand which are the words of Jesus and which aren't. I have a red-letter Bible, which is one of my best friends, this one, and the one I have back in my study. Mark chapter 4 is probably the reddest red-letter district of the entire Bible. Jesus is teaching, 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 teaching. They're hearing, but they're not hearing. They heard every word that he said along with the crowds. Hear, O Israel. To hear, to Shema, in the Bible, there are several levels. One level is, can you hear me? And audibly, does your ear work? That's Shema. But that's not the Shema God calls us to. Then there's the hearing. Can you mechanically, does your eardrum work? And do you understand? Yes, I understand. That's Shema. But that's not the Shema God calls us to. Then there's the hearing that your ear works. You understand, I understand you, and there's an emotional response. Oh, yes. That's Shemaing, but that's not the Shema that God calls us to. Then there's the highest level, the Shema that God calls us to. There's the hearing, I understand, it moves me, and my life is changed. My life is affected. That's the Shema that God calls us to. Shema, O Israel, Adonai Eloheinu, hear, O Israel, the Lord is our God. You can hear, I heard him. You can hear, I understand him. You can hear, oh, that moves me. But too many of us, And me too. Too many of us stop with the emotive response to God's word, and it's not reflected in the living of our lives. That's the Shema that God calls us to. That's the Shema that Jesus is calling his disciples to. But they heard, they understood, they probably were moved. But they step into the boat. Jesus falls asleep. There's the wind and there's the waves. It's a wild place for the disciples. And where is Jesus falling asleep? Literally, Jesus is apparently asleep at the wheel. He's asleep at the rudder, at the stern. Now, if we want to be like our rabbi, we want to be like Jesus, I want to be the most Jesus-filled George I can be, then you know where the disciples should have been? They should have been getting out their sleeping blankets and their pillows and been nestled up next to their rabbi and fall asleep. Because for Jesus, the storm is not a storm. I think Jesus is upset. I think Jesus uses the language that he uses for his disciples because his disciples of all people, they just didn't hear the teachings that Jesus had given to them that day. They had walked with him. They had seen him. They had seen him touch, ears to hear, eyes to see, open mouths so they could speak, touched sores and lepers were cleansed, fed thousands. And after all of that, in this storm, yes, it's scary, but you know what? When they said, "Don't you care?" the disciples knew more about the storm than they knew about their rabbi. And they were living their lives in response to the chaos than the one who brings shalom. And that kind of living Jesus calls cowardly. Listen, the disciples on the boat, I think they heard loud and clear what Jesus called them. I think they repented. And I think for their benefit and for ours to read the story and see it, it looks like he's asleep at the wheel, but his hand is on the universe, my friends. And this chaos, he will settle. He will calm the chaos of this lake for our benefits. But there will be a chaos, the chaos of the cross, that he will not calm. He will endure. And you and I need to endure with him. That's our calling. So Shema, O Israel, Adonai Eloheinu, Adonai Echad. Ve'ahavta et Adonai Elohecha b'chol lavavcha, uv'chol nafshecha, uv'chol meodecha. Ve'ahavta re'acha kamocha. Hear, O Israel, the Lord is our God, the Lord alone. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your strength, and love your neighbor as yourself. Jesus in the stern, in the storm, asleep, was exempling not just rest for his benefit, but love for ours.